بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. In our last lesson we spoke about how Sulaiman alayhi salam ruled the united kingdom of Israel, and all of Bani Israel were united under his rule. And Sulaiman alayhi salam was their king, and he was also their prophet. And Sulaiman alayhi salam took over the rule of this kingdom after his father Dawood alayhi salam. So this kingdom, this unified kingdom of Bani Israel under Dawood alayhi salam and then Sulaiman alayhi salam, this kingdom lasted for about a period of 90 years. So all of Bani Israel were unified under one kingdom for a period of approximately 90 years. But then after Sulaiman alayhi salam died, then the kingdom, it broke up and it became divided. And due to this loss of unity, the enemies of Bani Israel took advantage. So after Sulaiman alayhi salam passed away, the Fir'aun of Egypt, a man named Shishaniq, he invaded Philistine and he took over Jerusalem. He allowed Bani Israel to stay in Jerusalem and Philistine, but he forced Bani Israel to pay taxes to Egypt. So they were allowed to stay, but they had to pay this tribute, or they had to pay these taxes in order to stay there. Now this state of affairs remained for more than 150 years. Then in the year 740 before Isa alayhi salam, a people known as the Ashuriyun from Iraq, their capital was Nainawa in Iraq. These people, and they came and they invaded Philistine and they took over Philistine. This is the year 740. And they allowed Bani Israel to stay in Philistine, but again Bani Israel were forced to pay taxes to these Ashuriyun. Now the kingdom of the Ashuriyun, they were from Iraq. Their kingdom didn't last, it didn't survive much longer after that. So 8 years later, in the year 732 before Isa alayhi salam, the kingdom of the Ashuriyun was defeated from within Iraq by the Babylonians. So the Babylonians, who were based in Babylon, they defeated the Ashuriyun, whose capital was Nainawa. So these were two competing kingdoms within the same land, within Iraq. So the Babylonians, they defeated the Ashuriyun, and once the Babylonians defeated them, they took over all of their lands, and that included the land of Philistine, because the Ashuriyun had taken the land of Philistine. So now that the Babylonians have taken over the kingdom of the Ashuriyun, they take over all of their lands as well, and that includes Philistine. So now Philistine was under the rule of the Babylonians. This happened when? In the year 732 before Isa alayhi salam. Now again, Bani Israel, they're still living in Philistine at this time, and they have a type of semi-independence, but they have to pay taxes to Babylon. So they're allowed to live in Philistine, they're still allowed to live in Jerusalem. They have some form of limited independence, but they have to pay tribute to the Babylonians. Now this situation lasted for about 135 years, until the year 597 before Isa alayhi salam, when the kingdom of Babylon decided to take more active control of Philistine. Up to that point, yes, Palestine was under the umbrella of the kingdom of Babylon, but the Babylonians pretty much left the people in Palestine, Bani Israel, alone. They kind of left them alone to do their own thing. Right? Now in the year 597, the Babylonians want to take more active control of Philistine, so they actually invaded Philistine and they took over Jerusalem, and they took 10,000 of the Jews as prisoners. They took them back to Babylon to make them as slaves. including the king of Bani Israel. The person who was the king of Bani Israel, they took him as a slave as well. They took him to Babylon. So they took a total of 10,000, and they allowed the rest to remain there in Philistine. They allowed them to stay in Philistine, but before leaving, the Babylonians appointed a man named Zedekiah, who was from Bani Israel. He was a Jew himself. They appointed him to be the king of Bani Israel in Palestine. The Babylonians appointed an Israelite, a man from Bani Israel, Zedekiah, to be the king of Bani Israel within Palestine. But first they took a covenant from him. They took an agreement from him that although you are from Bani Israel, you are a Jew, your loyalty will be to us. Your loyalty will be to Babylon. So Zedekiah, he agreed to this. And so he was installed by the Babylonians as the king of Bani Israel. Now of course Bani Israel, the Jews, they didn't like this man. They didn't like Zedekiah, even though he was one of them. He's from Bani Israel himself. But they didn't like him for two reasons. First of all, because he promised his loyalty to the Babylonians. The Babylonians are the ones who came and took their land and enslaved them. Right? Took 10,000 of them to Babylon to become slaves. These are our enemies. How can you pledge your loyalty to them? So they were upset with him. They didn't like him for this reason. And also, they didn't appreciate him being installed as their king, because he did not come from the tribe of Bani Israel that the kings would come from. There was one certain tribe out of the 12 tribes of Bani Israel that the kings would come from that tribe. So Zedekiah was not from that tribe. He was not from the tribe of kings. So they didn't like him for this reason either. They didn't think that he deserves to be their king. So these are the two reasons they disliked him: his loyalty to Babylon and that he was not from the tribe of kings. Alright, so now Zedekiah, he ruled Bani Israel as the king installed by the Babylonians, and he remained loyal to the Babylonians for about 11 years. Then in the year 586 before Isa alayhi salam, this man Zedekiah, he had a change of heart. He thought to himself, why am I being loyal to our enemies? This is a betrayal of my own people. So he decided to revolt against Babylon and try to achieve independence for Bani Israel once again. So when this uprising began, he's starting an uprising with his people to fight against the Babylonians and regain independence for Bani Israel. When this uprising began, the king of Babylon himself got involved. And the king of Babylon was a man known as Bukhtunassar. In English, he is known as Nebuchadnezzar. Right? He was the king of Babylon. So when this uprising began, he came to Philistine himself, and he began a siege of Jerusalem. He surrounded Jerusalem with his army. And this siege lasted for a long time. He couldn't enter the city for a period of about 1.5 years. It took about 1.5 years, to actually be able to enter Jerusalem. So Bani Israel, they put up a pretty strong resistance that they were able to resist for 1.5 years. But eventually, Nebuchadnezzar was victorious and he entered Jerusalem. And when he entered Jerusalem, he totaled the city. He destroyed the city completely. He left it in ruins. And he took 40,000 from Bani Israel back to Babylon as prisoners to enslave them back in Babylon. He took 40,000 from Bani Israel. And he would have taken more, but the rest of them ran away. They fled Jerusalem. They ran away to Egypt. And after Nebuchadnezzar took 40,000 of the Jews to Babylon and the remainder ran away to Egypt, there remained a very small presence, a minimal presence of Bani Israel in Philistine. There were few still remaining in Philistine. They stayed in hiding, right? But the presence of Bani Israel in Philistine was almost obliterated, right? The vast majority were taken to Babylon, and a few more ran away to Egypt, and very few remained in Philistine. Alright, so Nebuchadnezzar, he died in the year 562 before Isa alayhi salam. And even after Nebuchadnezzar died, the majority of Bani Israel continued to live in Iraq, in Babylon, under Babylonian rule, because they were taken to Babylon. Now around this period, Bani Israel began the project of writing down the Torah. This is about 700 years after Musa alayhi salam. And Bani Israel had not written down the Torah up to this time, right? So now they decided, okay, we should write down the Torah. This is 700 years after Musa alayhi salam, 700 years after the Torah was revealed to Musa alayhi salam, right? So they thought, okay, we should actually write this down. So those Jews in Babylon and those Jews who had fled to Egypt and the few Jews who remained in Philistine, they started this work of writing down the Torah. Now how are they going to write down the Torah? Maybe they had some passages of it in memory from their ancestors, right? But a lot of it was lost. And a lot of what they recorded was things that their ancestors and they themselves added over the course of time. They added their own interpretations, they added their own innovations, they took some parts out, they changed some parts, right? So what they recorded, it was not as it was revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to Musa alayhi salam. This is 700 years later. And they're just relying upon, okay, what their father told them, what their grandfather told them. Perhaps they memorized some portions, perhaps they forgot other portions, perhaps some portions were altered, some portions were changed, some things were added, some things were taken out, right? So they wrote it down 700 years later in this way. And this writing, it went on for generations and generations, actually for centuries. So they started writing it about 700 years after Musa alayhi salam, and that writing continued for about 400 years. Right? Generation after generation, century after century, they kept writing, and they continued to do that for a period of about 400 years. Right? So you can imagine that the finished product here, it's not going to be authentic. Right? It's not going to be as it was revealed to Musa alayhi salam. There were many things that were altered, there were many things that were changed. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions this regarding Bani Israel. He says, فَوَيْلٌ لِلَّذِينَ يَكْتُبُونَ الْكِتَابَ بِأَيْدِيهِمْ ثُمَّ يَقُولُونَ هَذَا مِنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ. Woe be to those who write down the book with their own hands, and then they say this is from Allah. This is what Bani Israel did. Right? And they tried to use this writing as a means to elevate themselves and oppress others. Because from amongst the alterations that they made is that they made a claim, and they consider this part of their religion. They say that it's part of the Torah, even though of course this is not from what Allah revealed. And we know that, but they claim that this is from the Torah. They claim that it is allowed for them to oppress, to steal, and otherwise harm anyone else except for another Jew. Because they claim that they are the chosen people. They say they are Sha'bullah al-Mukhtar. They are Allah's chosen people, and everyone else is beneath them. Everyone else is lesser than them, inferior to them. So they say that it's not allowed for a Jew to do injustice to another Jew. But as for everyone else, then it's okay. It's okay to steal from them. It's okay not to return their trusts. It's okay to harm them in other ways. They believe this as part of their religion, right? So they use this in order to oppress other people, and this is part of the religion that they themselves have made up. So Bani Israel, they remained enslaved in Babylon with no real presence in Philistine for a number of years, until the year 539 before Isa alayhi salam. In that year, the year 539 before Isa alayhi salam, the king Qurash II, who was the Persian king, the king of the Persian Empire, he invaded Iraq. And he fought against the Babylonians, and he conquered the kingdom of Babylon. So now, Qurash II, the Persian king, he conquers Babylon. So now all of the lands of Babylon, all of the lands that Babylon had previously conquered, now they are under Persia. They're under the Persian Empire. Right? And that includes Philistine as well. So now Philistine came under Persian rule. Now Qurash II, who is the Persian king, he was a person who was not oppressive towards the Jews. He was not oppressive towards Bani Israel. He didn't have any problem with them. So he said to the Jews who were in Babylon, he said, if you guys want to go back to Philistine, you can go back. You're free to do so. Now by this time, the number of Jews in Babylon had increased, right? Remember, Nebuchadnezzar brought about 40,000 Jews to Babylon. But now a number of years have passed, they've had children. So now there were more than 100,000 Jews in Babylon. More than 100,000, right? So now the Persian Emperor, Qurash II, he said you can go back to Philistine if you would like. And if you would like to stay here in Babylon, you can stay here in Babylon. So now they are given permission to return to the Holy Land. They can return to Jerusalem if they want. But most of them, what do they decide? They decide, no, we don't want to go back, we're going to stay here in Babylon. Why was that? Why did they decide to stay in Babylon? Because Babylon was a very advanced city. It was an advanced civilization. The equivalent of what we would call today a first world country. Right? So they said, this is a nice place, we're going to stay here. They preferred to stay in a foreign land that was more comfortable rather than returning to the Holy Land. Right? It's similar to today. More Jews live in the United States than live in, Philistine. Even though, the Israeli government has made it very easy for any Jew to come back and settle there. But most of them, they don't take that offer and, they stay outside. And that shows that, they have more of a concern for the dunya than, the Holy Land. So that's how it was back in the day as well. Most of them decided to stay in Babylon instead of going back to Philistine. Out of the more than 100,000 that were there in Babylon, only about 40,000 went back to Philistine. And the rest, they remained in Babylon. That's why even today in Iraq, there is a significant Jewish population in Iraq. In Baghdad and other cities in Iraq, they even have Jewish neighborhoods there in Iraq. And these Jews have been in Iraq for centuries, since their ancestors were brought from Philistine to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. Alright, so about 40,000 went back to Philistine. Now as we mentioned, the Persian ruler was very lenient with Bani Israel. He didn't have any animosity towards them, and he actually gave them a portion of Jerusalem, and he gave them permission to self-govern themselves in that portion of the city. You can have this piece of land, you stay in that land, you govern yourselves, we're not going to interfere with your affairs, right? So it was a pretty peaceful arrangement between the Persians and Bani Israel. This arrangement lasted for about 200 years, and it was a peaceful time for Bani Israel when they were under Persian rule. Right? It was a peaceful time for them, and they were living under the umbrella of the Persian Empire during that time. Now this lasted until the year 332 before Isa alayhi salam. In the year 332 before Isa alayhi salam, a very powerful figure came into the picture. A man by the name of Alexander of Macedonia. And he's commonly known to us as Alexander the Great. Alexander, he was the king of the Greek kingdom of Macedonia. And he conquered many lands. He was a very successful military commander and a king, and he conquered many lands and formed one of the largest empires in history. All the way from Greece to northern India. Right? That's how big his empire was. And in the course of his expeditions, he defeated the Persian Empire. And he took over Philistine. He conquered Philistine. So now Philistine came under Greek rule. It came under Greek rule, and it remained under Greek rule until the death of Alexander in the year 323 before Isa alayhi salam. After the death of Alexander, then the Greek kingdom, it also became divided. And with this division of the Greek Empire, there were a group of people who are known as the Ambat al-Arab, whose capital was Petra in Jordan. They took advantage of the disunity within the Greek Empire. Okay, the Greeks, they're not unified anymore. This is our chance to take over at least some portion of Palestine from them. So these Ambat al-Arab, whose capital was in Petra in Jordan, they invaded the southern region of Palestine and they took it over, and it remained under their control for about 100 years until approximately the year 200 before Isa alayhi salam. Alright, so we're coming closer and closer to the time of Isa alayhi salam. Now it's only about 200 years before Isa alayhi salam. Alright, in the year 167 before Isa alayhi salam, one of the offshoot empires, when the Greek Empire was divided after the death of Alexander the Great, one of those offshoot empires was a Greek empire named the Seleucid Empire. Right? That was one of the offshoots of the Greek Empire. So this Seleucid Empire in the year 167 before Isa alayhi salam, they came and they took over Palestine. Now these Seleucids, these Greeks, they were very unjust people. They were brutal people, and they greatly oppressed Bani Israel. The king of the Seleucid Empire actually tried to force Bani Israel to leave their religion and to follow the Greek religion and worship Zeus. Zeus is one of the false Greek gods, right? So the king of the Seleucid Empire, he tried to force Bani Israel into the worship of Zeus. And many of Bani Israel, under this pressure, rather most of them, the majority of them, under this pressure from the Seleucid Empire, they left their religion and they started worshipping Zeus. Right? So now Bani Israel basically became two groups. Those who followed the Greeks and the religion of the Greeks, and they became known as the Greek Jews, because they were ethnically from Bani Israel Jews, but they were following the religion of the Greeks. So they became known as the Greek Jews, and they were the majority. And then there was a group who remained firm upon their religion. They refused to follow the way of the Greeks, and they had to flee from Jerusalem. They had to leave Jerusalem because of the pressure of the Seleucids upon them in Jerusalem. So they fled Jerusalem to escape the Greek oppression. These people who fled Jerusalem and remained true to their religion, they were known as the Maccabees. They were known as the Maccabees because the majority of them were from the Jewish tribe of Al-Maccabiya. And their leader, the leader of these Jews, was a man named Yehuda al-Maccabi. Yehuda al-Maccabi. And this is an important name because he has a significant role later on. Alright, so these Maccabees, they had to leave Jerusalem. They fled with their religion and they left Jerusalem, but they gathered together and they tried to organize an army to revolt against these oppressive Seleucids, right? And many battles took place between the Maccabees of Bani Israel and the Greek Seleucid Empire. A number of battles took place between them over the next few years, and the Jews, the Maccabees, were actually somewhat successful in some of these battles. They were actually somewhat successful in some of these battles, but they could not take down the Seleucids completely. But they were able to inflict a number of casualties upon them. So they were somewhat successful. So finally, after a few years of fighting, the Seleucid emperor, he didn't want to fight anymore. He didn't want to fight anymore. So in the year 165 before Isa alayhi salam, the Seleucid emperor, he issued an order to stop the oppression of Bani Israel. He ordered his people, the Greeks, we cannot oppress Bani Israel anymore. Leave them alone. Let them worship as they please. Don't force them into your religion. Don't force them into your culture, right? So this order was issued, and the Maccabees, those Jews who remained firm upon their religion and were forced to leave Jerusalem, they were allowed now to come back into Jerusalem in peace. They were allowed to come back into Jerusalem in peace. So on the 25th day of the first month in the year 164 before Isa alayhi salam, these Maccabees, these Jews, they re-entered Jerusalem. They re-entered Jerusalem holding candles, right? Holding candles, lighted candles. They entered Jerusalem, and that day became known to them as the holiday of lights, Hanukkah, right? This is the holiday of lights. They came into Jerusalem with their candles. And so Hanukkah, for the Jews, it signified their return to Jerusalem after having been forced to flee. So they entered with these candles, and that's why the symbol of Hanukkah is the menorah with the candles, right, that you see, right? And they consider this to be one of their most holy days, right? So that's the history behind why the Jews celebrate Hanukkah, right? So this is the history of Bani Israel up to about 160 years before the coming of Isa alayhi salam. So inshallah we'll stop there for today bi'idhnillah, and inshallah next week we will continue with the next few years of the history of Bani Israel and the history of Palestine bi'idhnillah. Barakallahu feekum, wallahu a'lam, wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.